Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and we're going to be talking again about Iran today, Iran and China specifically. And with us again, friend of the show, old colleague of mine, John Maguire, retired CIA operations officer, spent huge amounts of time overseas in the Middle East in particular, continues to travel extensively and do business extensively in that area. So his knowledge, not just historical, but very, very current. John, welcome.
Thanks, Sam.
So, look, last time you and I were talking, we were kind of talking. I think the focus was primarily Iran and this situation inside and the prospects for regime change. But what I want to do today is talk about Iran and China. And for most people, those two things probably don't go together in the same sentence too much. Like the average American thinks about China and probably not in a favorable way, especially these days, and thinks about Iran and maybe is generally oblivious to kind of the lash up between these two nations, both of which are, I would submit, hostile to the United States. So overall, I mean, just start with this. What is the kind of strategic, if that's the right word, nature of the relationship between the Chinese and the Iranians?
Sam, that's a really current question now because of all the things that have happened with the COVID virus and the global distraction. I know it's much more than a distraction, but for purposes of discussion from the intel side, the focus of attention and the bandwidth that comes from the leadership circles of every country right now is all sucked up into this storm about how to manage the economic impact, the disease itself, and all the fallout from the decisions that have been made since when it started somewhere around January or before. But the Chinese and other hostile powers, I look at Iran, China, Russia in a very similar optic. They don't slow down. They don't do drawdowns. They don't do shelter in place. They don't shut their services down the way we do. We have turned off our system in large measure, and they see this as a window of opportunity. And the Iranians have cemented, I shouldn't say just Iran, I should focus it more. It's the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps has steadily built a much more close, cooperative relationship with the Chinese. And from what I've been told from people inside the Iran system, that relationship has blossomed into a much larger and more comprehensive strategic relationship. You look at the access that China has now to locations inside Iran, strategic locations like Kish Island inside the Straits of Hormuz, just inside the Gulf, and on the outside, Chobhar port, which is a deep blue water ocean port on the Iran coast, on the approach routes to the Straits of Hormuz from the outside. The Chinese are looking at establishing themselves a military presence in a larger area than they have historically in the South China Sea area. And Iran has given them an opportunity to project their force and power into those regions. If they are able to complete what looks like some type of a lease agreement, which would include billions of dollars in payments for over the course of, say, 20 years, how is the U.S. going to handle, or the West in general, and the international shipping that is affected by having more military ships in one of the most confined waterways on the earth? And Kish Island and the Strait of Hormuz is a busy place. When you add in another naval force with a strategic location on both ends of the straits, that changes the national security policy profile that the U.S. operates under. And I don't hear anything at all, certainly in the media here in the States, but I don't hear a word out of the government. You just don't hear it. I assume that it's just been tramped out by the news of the pandemic, but these developments are moving forward. And a cash payment system for leasing, one of the first questions that comes to mind is, how is that going to be managed by the sanctions regime, under the sanctions regime? Because the Chinese are just projecting power in a very similar way that we do with base access agreements. If you lease like we lease other areas around the world for military access. That's what they're doing. But it's a change. And I see it as something that really should capture a lot of attention. And I'm just curious, is there any attention on this at
Yeah,
all?
yeah. I mean, just to drill down on this just for a second. I mean, we spend a lot of time focused on the South China Sea, or at least you see that come up in the popular press. That people have sort of generally gotten in their heads the idea that the Chinese have made this land grab, built these artificial islands, and it's not just that they're taking a big chunk of the Pacific Ocean. It is as you're well aware, an incredibly strategic body of water. I mean, the amount of shipping that flows through there and the implications of the Chinese basically being able to shut off the South China Sea. I mean, this is true old school geopolitical strategic stuff. What you're
Hmm.
talking about now in regard to the Gulf is exactly the same kind of thing. I mean, we talk about the Iranians and sometimes disparage their naval capabilities, but still they are a significant threat on their own to all the shipping that goes through there. Now, my God, you add to that the possibility that we have a Chinese naval base and their capabilities and their ships and their equipment and their money there. Again, this is old school, going back to Mahan geopolitical change the balance of power in the world stuff, I think.
Yeah. And the Iranians, the Revolutionary Guard, I think is very comfortable with the Chinese Communist Party model and the way the Chinese system controls their population and their economy inside the country. I think with all that has happened with the sanctions and the squeeze on the theocracy and the government of Iran overall, Revolutionary Guard is looking for opportunities to cement their control over the country and get past the theocracy as it's currently configured with these old mullahs that are getting rich, but the country's stuck. One of their biggest national security threats for Iran right now is to stay in power. So there's this tenuous balance that's going on inside Iran with the economic squeeze of the sanctions, the cost of all these foreign wars and surrogate operations that project all the way down to Yemen, into Iraq. The funnel of money that comes out of Iraq is not limitless, and it's not enough to keep the Iranian economy afloat, but it is enough to cripple the Iraqi economy and the Iraqi government. So all these moving parts that Iran has, I look at it from the optic of the way you and I came through the system is if there is a strategic decision made to adjust this, there are ample opportunities of points of pressure to reach in and do something without risking troops, without expanding the combat footprint in the area, without creating a larger conflict. The Iranians are very exposed all across the region. And I always question, what are we doing to counter what they're doing? If they are able to control things the way they are in some of these countries, they must have a lot of assets. They've got a lot of cooperative people. What's being done to disrupt that, to disrupt their ability to project power? From what I've seen in Iraq and talking to the guys from Baghdad who are in the intel service, as well as the Kurds, I just don't see a lot of activity on the counter side of the balance, the ledger for us. What are
Yeah,
we doing? I don't think we're doing much at all.
no, and I agree with you. And we touched on this a little bit the last time you talked, and I've discussed this myself, on the air and writing. We seem to get locked into this mode where it's sort of like to the extent we respond to, well, to begin with, all we do is respond, which is
Yeah.
right there the definition of the problem. And then when we respond, it's into this limited tit for tat thing. And you talked about this the last time we were speaking, so they rocket a base and we blow up an ammunition dump. And when it's all done, the net result of that is nothing other than probably reminding them that our responses are always going to be so limited that it's not really a deterrent. In other words, they didn't take away from that any lesson that discourage them. All that did was tell them keep doing the same thing. But as you're
Yes.
talking about, we're not dismantling their capabilities. We're not preventing them from continuing to build these Hezbollah clones all over the Middle East. We're
Uh-huh.
not taking out the IRGC infrastructure. We're not doing anything meaningful. We're
Yeah.
just so back to the sort of the China angle here. One of the things that go and looking at it through the lens of the coronavirus for a second, Iran has had a huge problem with deaths and the scope of the coronavirus. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because they continued, and I think to this day continue, to maintain regular air travel between China and Iran. And I think to the extent that people are aware of that, when they read it probably over the last couple of months, it was surprising. Like,
Yeah.
why would there be so much contact between Iran and China? But in fact, that cooperation is pretty robust between the Chinese and the Iranians. I mean, it,
And it hasn't slowed with the virus. There's flights to and from China almost daily, major flights with passengers on there, which is there's no quarantine procedures in place, according to what I've been told from inside. The Iranian official hospital system is now viewed by the population as a place, if you go into the hospital, you're going to get infected. So they've stopped going in large numbers to the state run hospitals. The private hospitals, and there are some sprinkled around Iran, are out of supplies as well and are trying to purchase medical supplies outside of Iran. But as these efforts begin, the Revolutionary Guard gets into the process and turns it into a corrupt deal. One which I heard about was just mass, and trying to get mass into the country and get a good quality mass that could be distributed and used in the private hospitals was taken apart by the Revolutionary Guard. And then you've got where they're controlling it, and no one's going to sell them anything. So the sales stop, and the people have nothing as far as personal protection equipment. It's just non-existent for the average Iranian. People are making things out of T-shirts and things that they learn on the internet, but overall, there's nothing there. They're short of a lot of equipment, but the process of the constant flow back and forth to China, you have to wonder how much larger will the infection rate get as this continues, because there's so little truth out there. Certainly from our optic here, how little truth we get on what's really going on with the numbers and the genesis of all this. And you have to assume the people in Iran they're driving along with rumors only, rumors and hope. That's it. They've got nothing else coming in.
well, a couple of things that you've said as we've been talking here, I think, again, deserve emphasis because we end up with this silliness, I'll just call it, in discussion inside the United States these days, in regard to political sensitivities and what speech is allowed and what speech is not allowed. And so you end up where if you criticize China, instantaneously you're branded as being criticizing the Chinese people, and now this is some sort of racist or ethnic slur. And the same thing about Iran, as if what we're talking about is criticizing the people of China or the people of Iran, which is about as close to 180 degrees out from what we're saying as is possible. Because what we're really talking about is trying to free both of those nations from horrible, oppressive entities that abuse their own people more than they abuse anybody else on the planet. I mean, you're very good about talking, for instance, about the IRGC, which the Revolutionary Guard Corps that has come to in many ways dominate Iran. Well, they're not friends of the Iranian people. They're not.
No.
They don't give a damn about the Iranian people, as you're pointing out. I
Uh-huh.
mean, they're going to make sure they're taken care of to the best they can, no matter what the crisis is. What happens to the average Iranian does not matter to them one whit. This, let's just be clear about that. They are, in that sense, a parallel to the the Chinese Communist Party. They're going to take care of themselves, and the first people, the people they're going to be most brutal to on the planet are their own people.
And that has been enabled by the current situation with the pandemic. As long as the population is suffering and focused on getting infected or managing infection after they get it, it keeps the crowds from reforming in the streets the way that we saw before all this began, when you can get 1 million kids in the street, kids, young people that can get in the street and protest before the pandemic began. That has been diffused by this sickness. I'm sure the Revolutionary Guard is fine with the current infection rate and chaos in the medical system because it has prevented a recurrence of massive street protests.
Yeah, and just as an aside there, back when these protests were at their height, one of the most powerful things I saw, in other words, impacted me personally, was video that was coming out of Tehran, I believe, and obviously coming out on Twitter or something, which is a feat because the Iranians do a lot to try to prevent that. But it showed where the regime had basically painted on this broad pedestrian walkway American and Israeli flags, and particularly in the video was the American flag. So the whole idea was everybody's supposed to walk on this painting of the American flag,
Yeah.
thereby showing their disrespect, particularly in the Middle East. That taken as sort of the ultimate insult. And what it showed was these hundreds and hundreds of what appear to be university age people, men and women, going out of their way to walk around the flag and refuse to step on this American flag.
Yeah.
Which if you think these people are all brainwashed and really believe in their system,
Yeah.
that ought to snap you back to reality. They know exactly what this is, and what they're saying by that one little action is, no, I'm not going down this road with you.
That little flicker of liberty and freedom of thought is still there. It's just not bright, but it's there. There's something about trying to extinguish that. The Iranians won't give in. They'll do what they have to do to make it, but they haven't given in.
So, I mean, part of what I'm hearing from talking to you is that, you know, it's not just that we got to confront the Iranians or come up with a coherent policy and start taking apart this IRGC network that's all over the Middle East, et cetera. But sort of more broadly, I mean, geopolitically and strategically, we got to confront this whole lash up with the Chinese and the Iranians, and probably that takes us to, changing dramatically our approach to the Chinese. Stop trying to think of them as like we're all going to be buddies one of these days.
That's one of the big discussion points that I wish would become a national level discussion on where are we headed with all this. These kinds of major strategic decisions and things that we're seeing in front of us that are actually occurring, we're standing flat-footed. And I watched these kinds of things happen in previous years in the organization where you see the U.S. we're looking at things clearly, but we're not doing anything about it. And we perseverate on making a decision until some factor, some event forces a decision. I remember the Clinton administration mastered that with their process of the memorandum of notification process, which was the throttle control. You can say the right things, look like you're doing something, and then when there's time to actually do something, where normally the organizations underneath of the executive branch would have the authorities to move forward to do things, it's all held up based on one decision paper that they don't say yes and they don't say no. They just don't say anything. And then it sits. We watched this with bin Laden. We watched those decisions roll up to the brick wall and stop. And then in 2001, they rolled over us in September. Then none of that should have been a surprise to a lot of people, and it wasn't a surprise to a lot of people in the agency. But the dots were there. You connect them as best you can, but it also requires some level of action. You've got to do something to trigger something. And I see a lot of similarities now. We're standing flat-foot looking at these issues around. The Iranians have said things, and there's a friend of mine that translates the Ayatollah's speeches and comments as at a native Farsi level. So she's able to, this is exactly what he said, and this is what it means on what he's saying. When you're a native Farsi speaker and a native English speaker, you can dissect it. And he's given us every warning that he can give that something is coming in the next few months, a surprise of some type. Little comments that were made, like on a tail end of a sentence during the funeral of Soleimani. In 3 months, we won't have to bow down, or we won't be blocked from doing anything. And they say things like that. We have historically looked at that as just it's just bluster, he's just a third world guy running his mouth. When under his system, they give you a warning. They tell you what they're going to do to give you time to repent and to convert and to submit. It's a lot of it's pro forma bluster, but it's real. And when they say something like that, we blow it off or don't even look at it because it doesn't get translated in the context that you need to read it and understand what did he want, what did he mean when he said this. That kind of analysis, I don't know if that goes on anymore. Where you have native speakers that can tell you this is what this means. This is important. We learn languages as case officers, but to get to the granularity level of a native speaker takes your whole career. And if you work in the language at some point, you might get there. But today, Farsi's complicated, and we don't have a good grasp on it. We haven't been there since 79, so we don't have any understanding of the society from actually living in the country. There is advantage to having an embassy where you can actually talk to Iranians every day, but we've got none of that. We're essentially out in a sterile bubble looking back at an organization and a structure and a country and culture that we haven't really touched or engaged since 1979, and our exit was really abrupt and nasty. So where are we today with that? We've pulled in the antenna even farther when we've created this process around the region that we're locked down inside of these giant embassy forts that we live in, or you live in an FOB and you can't touch anybody. You can't talk to locals and go out and sit down and have a shawarma with somebody and ask them what the hell's going on here today. None of
Yeah.
that's going on that I've seen. I certainly have never stumbled onto a case officer doing anything inside Iraq in the last 5 years. And if
Yeah.
I can drive around in a country like that, looking the way I do, I would certainly think that they could go out. It's just nuts what we're doing, and we're so disconnected from what's happening. And I believe the Iranians are planning something for this presidency. They're going to do something before the election. There's ample indications of preparations and movements of people and fighters. They're doing things in Iraq right now that are not don't appear to be on the radar scope of our system. Maybe they are. God, I hope they are. But what are we doing to counter this? They've adapted already to
Yeah.
what we've done in the last fight with ISIS. They've already adjusted and are redeploying now.
I everything you say obviously resonates with me. I mean, I'm a big supporter of sanctions. I'm a big supporter of throttling down those sanctions as tight as you possibly can. Um, but you also have to understand that as you do that, and they begin to bite, which they are, uh, everything that I mean, not only are you talking about a hostile regime, but you're talking about a hostile regime that potentially becomes that much more desperate.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think then that we would be ratcheting up preparation for that. Quite frankly, not just ratcheting up preparation, but looking to preempt that. And I, like you, worry about it. And your comments about sort of our I don't know, lack of flexibility, our lack of awareness, the kind of the overall stiffness of our policy, to me, some of that is reflected in the fact that we seem to have become, since 9/11, ever more reliant upon the military. And
Yes.
I don't say that as a critic of I mean, I wore the uniform. I was in the Army. My dad's a career military officer. My brother's a retired Army colonel. My son did 2 combat tours in Helmand province as a Marine machine gunner. So I got nothing but respect for the U.S. military, but it can't be the only tool in your toolbox. And for a lot of what we're talking about, what you're talking about, combating the IRGC, stopping them from moving weapons, taking their personnel off the street, getting rid of operatives that are ready to blow something up, whatever. A lot of this is in the shadows kind of stuff that requires intelligence and diplomatic stuff and relations with foreign countries. And This is not carrier battle groups and armored divisions. But we seem to have become so reliant upon this idea that the conventional military is going to solve all these problems that then we're down to a binary choice. Either don't do anything or make a conventional military response. And this entire spectrum that you're talking about of action, at which we're actually pretty good when we're allowed to do it, is just taken off the table. We
You're
can't
right.
we can't do anything until they fire rockets into the green zone, and then we'll just go bomb something, and that constitutes the full range of our response, as opposed to what you and I both know. Given the right go ahead, a half dozen guys working in the shadows could do to dismantle that whole apparatus.
You're absolutely right, Sam. And that's the part that troubles so many of us. The Title 50 authorities that carry such a stigma with a lot of people in the government and certainly a lot of people in the agency, the president's toolbox of doing things before you have to send the military. There is a big chasm between the diplomatic service and the commitment of combat forces on the ground, and it was created to prevent war. The agency was designed to forecast and prevent conflict. If we end up in a shooting war with conventional army, then there's an argument that can be made that we failed, that we ended up, this is the only choice. We haven't exhausted all the other choices, but if we end up at that, then what have we done? What has the community, the intelligence community done? Not enough. That argument is easy to make. And I'm not sure that there's so much there's so many reasons for this. It'd be crazy to try and explain them all now, but the facts are there's so much opportunity that can be done to head this off. Sometimes with a CA program, the whole goal is just to turn the ship of state 2 degrees starboard so that a foreign adversary has to adjust course. And if they adjust course, then you've bent their operational curve in a certain direction. A lot of it can be done through counterintelligence operations. The Iranians are enormously vulnerable to that. And they're vulnerable because their forces are so far projected from their ability to resupply and actually direct things. And you can touch them in so many locations. We did that in the Cold War against a number of adversaries, and it causes them to increase their burn rate of cash. The Iranians are very short of cash. Anything that you can do from the intelligence side to exacerbate that problem of cash flow is a useful tool in curbing their operational trajectory on what their goals are, bending them in a different direction.
Yeah,
And
and as you
I just
point out,
don't see it today. I don't see any of that going on.
yeah, and as you point out, I mean, not to get too down in the weeds of conversation that maybe we dive into in a future segment, but okay, if I have Iranian intel guys and Revolutionary Guard Corps guys spread out over a wide area, not only are their operations vulnerable and things that we can do against them, not necessarily kinetically, but all the ways that you've suggested. But also, the reality is here. I mean, from an intel standpoint, a lot of those guys are fully aware of just how messed up their own system is. A lot of those guys know very well that this is hell, and they go along to get along and do what they have to do in their system. You get
Mhm.
one of those guys face to face under the right circumstances, if you know what you're doing, where you're not blowing his cover, you're not getting him killed. You, you and I both know you're going to find that some of those guys are going to say, "Thank God," and yes, I'll help you. They're going to
I've been
say,
trying to find an American, but I have no way of reaching you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, if you're smart and you know what you're doing, and again, you're not ham-handed, so
Yeah,
you're not doing this in front of his buddies and getting him killed or getting him recalled to Tehran. But what you're going to find behind closed doors if you pass the acid test is he's going to say, "I've been waiting for the Americans to come into Tehran and free us for 40 years. What can I
yeah.
do? What can I
How can
do?"
I help?
And or you're just going to find, I'm a mercenary individual. How much you going to pay me?
Yeah,
I'll tell you whatever. But if you don't, if you're not out there, as you keep saying, if you're not engaging, if you're not touching them, if you're not in the shadows, if you're not on the street, none of these opportunities appear. I mean,
Exactly.
you
You've got
can.
to be on the playing field in order to to get a hit now and then. You got to show up.
Somebody in Washington D.C. is pointing to a map and saying we got 200 guys here, and claiming that that's a great success. What he's not saying is, but none of those 200 guys ever leave the wire,
Yeah,
never go talk to anybody, right? They're just sitting there. They might as well be in a cubicle in Washington because you're not letting them do anything.
exactly. What we've created today is the utopian structure for micromanagement. That the field stations are no longer independent operating platforms. They're just a branch of a headquarters group.
Well,
They're just
you
a
ever see,
far-flung branch.
you ever see the movie Aliens, the
Yeah,
sequel to the first one, and the movie begins right. I love, you know, I'm always into action adventure movies because I got enough reality in my life. So
yeah, me too.
when I sit down in front of a television, I'm looking for something to turn my brain off and just get lost in it. And I love the beginning of that movie. I've always used it as an analogy for exactly what you're getting at, where the lieutenant sits inside his armored personnel carrier and he has a camera hanging on each Marine's head, and he's trying individually to tell each one of them exactly which way to turn and what to do, and that, and then one by one they're all killed, and, he's screaming into the microphone because they won't answer him anymore,
Yeah,
and finally I think it's Sigourney Weaver who's yelling, "They're all dead."
yeah.
And I always felt that be an analogy for exactly what you just described so brilliantly. This micromanage fly by wire
Yeah,
approach. Like, no, we're not going to put you in the street and rely upon the fact that you know what you're doing. We're going to try to
exactly.
pull these little puppet strings from back home.
General Flynn had the best phrase I've ever heard is some years ago when he described it as Washington's constant desire to have the 5,000-mile screwdriver. They we could do it better from here with a
Yes.
5,000-mile screwdriver.
Yeah, I put together an op once, which I won't go into the details of for obvious reasons, that involved us in a boat meeting another boat that was coming out of a hostile country, and they were going to bring us a guy that we wanted to put our hands on. So we're
Uh-huh.
just two boats. We're going to meet in the middle of this body of water, and we're going to take possession of this individual. And then I asked the Navy for assistance
Oh my God.
because I thought, well, maybe we'd get some SEALs to come with us, and that required going to the brass. The next thing I know, I went to a meeting, and they were explaining to me how the entire op would now be run by a Navy admiral on a nuclear aircraft carrier 1,000 miles away, who was going to look at video relayed to him from a drone, and then he would radio us in the boat and tell us what we were going to
Yeah.
do, what we were going to do. And I was like, okay.
Yep.
So
What could possibly go
I'm
wrong?
sorry I invited you to the party. You're now disinvited. I'm going back to doing this with my boat.
Yes.
I'm
But I'll
not
figure out a solution.
I'm not sitting in the boat looking at the other boat waiting for a call from the admiral 1,000 miles away
Yep.
telling me what I can do.
We're doomed.
All right, John, I think that's it. We've reached the logical conclusion. That's a great place to wrap up this segment. We will
Well, I look forward to
we
talking more about it. There's so much happening right now,
absolutely.
and
This
it's cooking off right now.
second in a number of segments. Thanks for being with us.
All right, Sam. Thanks so much. Bye bye.
Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.